errors and exceptions, throw, require, assert, and revert. Let's start with transactions in general and errors that are happening. Now, one thing that I've mentioned continuously throughout the course is that transactions are atomic on the Ethereum blockchain. That means that when errors are happening, they are state reverting. So whenever you update a state, let's say somewhere on the top of one of your functions, and then something happens, and then somewhere a revert or an assert or a require triggers. Everything that happened before will be reverted as well. So it doesn't matter what you do before, the whole transaction, everything will not happen. Now, require, assert, and revert, those three things are fairly new, well, not new anymore, but they were not here since the beginning of Solidity. At the beginning, there was only a throw statement, so whenever you see throw, you know that it's deprecated by now. The new thing is using require, assert, and revert. When you think back at the beginning of the previous lecture, I said there's an if amount is smaller than the balance that the user has, and then it can transfer funds out of the smart contract. In the previous versions of Solidity, there would be an else statement. If the amount is greater than the user has, throw. And this throw doesn't exist anymore. Now, exceptions cascade. So even though maybe you send funds to another smart contract, in this other smart contract there is an revert or an assert or a require triggered. That means that also inside your smart contract, the whole transaction will be reverted. The thing is, it works for all the high-level functions. That is high-level interaction with other smart contracts, which we haven't covered yet, or high-level transfer funds. This is the transfer function. It doesn't cascade for low-level functions. Low-level functions are this address send, the send function, the call function, the delegate call function, and the static call function. We haven't talked about those yet, and I want to talk about in later lectures, maybe even in later sections of the course about those. Now, when a require happens, you cannot catch those things. Require will just completely terminate the transaction, and there is no catching mechanism whatsoever inside Solidity. There are catching mechanisms outside of Solidity, so when you interact with the blockchain, then you can figure out that the transaction was reverted and then react to those things. But inside Solidity, you cannot react to an exception that is thrown. If you want to give the user some information about what happened, then you can add a return string or an error string to require and revert as well. We haven't covered revert, but it works very much the same as require, just doesn't take an argument. As a first argument, it takes already the error string. That means if you call revert, it's like a require that evaluates to false. Okay, now we have covered assert and require in the previous example, but what exactly is the difference? Because both are obviously just terminating the transaction. What is the difference between those, and when should you use assert and when should you use require? As Solidity is compiling down to EVM bytecode, and both assert and require have a different bytecode. So it's a different trigger in the bytecode that lets the EVM know, wait, something happened, we are going to terminate the transaction. For revert, it's 0xFT, and for assert, it's 0xFE, and the EVM reacts differently to those. The only thing that is the same is it will terminate the transaction, but something more happens behind the scenes. For a revert, when you transfer gas to the smart contract in order to execute different operations, computational stuff on your smart contract, then let's say at the very beginning of your function, there's already a require terminating the transaction. The remaining gas, which wasn't used, will be returned to the user. In case of an assert, it will just consume all the gas that was sent to the smart contract and not return it to the user. We're talking about gas in a different lecture. I cannot cover it in this lecture. It's going to be too much. Just remember, require returns gas, assert doesn't return gas.
Fair.
Now, assert is here, assert should never be triggered. Assert is something that should only be triggered if something unexpected happens with your smart contract. Something totally unexpected. It's not depending on user input. It is something like a checksum doesn't apply, or there is suddenly funds missing from your smart contract. So when you check for a balance in your smart contract, then suddenly something unexpected happens and somebody made your variables wrap around and your checks don't apply anymore. This is where assert can be used. Require is here to validate user input. If the user enters something wrong, then, well, he gets his remaining gas refunded and he can try again and see if that works later on. Also, require lets you return an error string and assert doesn't. Assert is just terminating the transaction without any further notice to the user, except that he knows that the transaction is terminated. Well, and assert is also triggered if you internally do something wrong with the coding part of smart contracts in Solidity. So for example, you try to reach an array out of bounds. An out of bounds index error is triggering an assert style exception. If you try to do a division by 0, that is something that should never happen. That's an assert style exception. If you do byte shifting by a negative amount, which you cannot do, triggering an assert style exception. If you convert a value to big or negative to an enum, which hopefully you will never do, but just is good to know. If you are zero initializing a variable of an internal function type, which you cannot do, and we haven't even talked about internal function types, or, well, if you actually triggering an assert which evaluates to false. So this would trigger an assert. What would trigger a require? Well, the first thing is if you require something which evaluates to false, that would be the obvious thing. If you are doing a function call via a message call, but it doesn't finish properly, so if you are interacting with another smart contract and it doesn't finish, then the require, well, it would be a require style exception that would be thrown, except for these low-level calls, where I said it's just returning a Boolean actually and tells you then if it finished properly or not. If you are trying to reach a smart contract externally which are not containing any code, this would trigger a require statement. So if you're trying to interact with an address which doesn't contain any code, if your smart contract receives Ether but with a function that doesn't contain this payable keyword, if you remember, we always used send money with public payable. If the payable is missing, then it would trigger an exception. If your contract receives Ether at a view function, a getter function, or if the transfer fails, address transfer fails, which is the high-level function, then it would trigger a require style exception. Great. Throw is the old style. It's outdated, it's deprecated now. It was removed in Solidity 04.10. There are tons of examples out there in different YouTube videos where they use Solidity 04.10 or below because it was quite famous, and then the price of Ether dropped after that, so people stopped producing new videos about this. Unlike this one, this is fairly new. And the old version would be if message sender is not the owner, then throw, and now we have the requires if, require message sender is owner. So this would kind of reverse the whole idea and give you, well, more clear statement of what you expect, in what state you expect your contract to be. Then there is the last thing that we haven't talked about in the lab, which is revert. It reverts the transaction. It does pretty much the same as require, and just that when you call revert, it is like a require false. And yeah, that's it pretty much. It's up to your preference. So there's no true or false when to use a revert and when to use a require. It's totally up to your own preference. Even the Solidity docs say so, that there's not one way is better than the other way. So you could do if amount is greater than half of the value that was sent to the smart contract, or I don't know, something like this. or the alternative way is require amount blah 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 and then the error string. So both would be the exact same error. Great. Let me tell you the key takeaways. Use require for input validation. I hope I said it enough in this lecture. Use assert for checking internal states or so-called invariants. And for both, if they evaluate to true, then it works. And if they evaluate to false, then the transaction is aborted. And well, it's the same as revert with the require.